"Let me go, you bastards." Nina's voice cut through the dark interior of the van as the door slammed shut beside her. One of the men cursed under his breath. "Relax," he said, tightening the zip tie around her wrists. "You borrowed money. You knew this day would come." "You've got the wrong woman," Nina replied flatly. The younger kidnapper smirked. "They all say that." The van accelerated, tires hissing over wet pavement. Nina didn't struggle again. She sat still, observing everything: the cheap restraints, the shaky breathing of the man across from her, the nervous tapping of fingers on a handgun that had likely never been fired outside a shooting range. Amateur. 10 minutes later, the van stopped outside an abandoned warehouse near the New Jersey docks. The sliding door opened, cold wind rushing inside. "Move," one of them ordered. They pulled her out roughly, pushing her into a metal chair positioned beneath a harsh overhead light. Minutes passed. Then the sound of approaching footsteps echoed across concrete. Daniel Mercer entered calmly, buttoning his coat as he walked. At 40 years old, Daniel had built a reputation as a man who preferred controlled outcomes. He did not believe in unnecessary violence. Fear was useful only when measured carefully. He stopped when he saw Nina. His expression hardened slightly. "This isn't her," he said. The room went quiet. One of the men shifted nervously. "Same uniform, boss. Same restaurant." Daniel studied Nina carefully. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pleading. She was evaluating. "Untie her," Daniel said. One of the captors hesitated. "Boss, what if she talks?" Nina leaned forward slightly. "You're already talking too much," she said. The man grabbed her shoulder aggressively. The mistake happened instantly. Nina twisted her wrists, creating just enough slack to rotate her arms. Her foot snapped upward in a precise taekwondo kick, striking the man's knee sideways. He collapsed with a shout before he understood what happened. Another rushed forward. Her elbow struck his throat with controlled force, dropping him to the floor gasping. A third reached for his gun. Nina pivoted, sweeping his legs from under him with a sharp rotational kick. The weapon slid across the concrete. 5 seconds. 3 men down. Silence swallowed the warehouse. Daniel raised a hand slowly, signaling the others not to move. Nina remained standing now, the cut zip tie hanging loosely from one wrist, her breathing steady, her expression calm. "You planned to scare someone tonight," Nina said evenly. "Instead, you found someone who doesn't scare easily." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice remained controlled. "Who are you?" "Someone you grabbed without asking questions." One of the remaining men lifted his gun halfway. Nina didn't even look at him. "If he pulls that trigger," she said calmly, eyes still on Daniel, "he'll regret it faster than he can blink." Daniel believed her. He nodded once. The gun lowered. "You were not the intended target," Daniel said. "I figured that out when your men started improvising," Nina replied. Tension shifted in the room. Daniel studied the spacing of her stance, the balance in her posture. "Training. Years of it. Why didn't you fight in the van?" Daniel asked. "No reason to escalate before understanding the situation." Daniel gave a slight nod of reluctant respect. "You're free to go," he said. One of the guards whispered urgently, "Boss, what if she goes to the police?" Nina gave a faint, humorless smile. "If I wanted the police involved, this conversation would already be over." Before Daniel could respond, the distant sound of engines echoed outside the warehouse. Headlights flashed briefly through the high windows. One of Daniel's men rushed to the door and looked out. "Boss, we've got company." Daniel's eyes hardened. Rivals. Someone had followed the pickup. Nina glanced toward the entrance, assessing angles automatically. "You didn't just make one mistake tonight," she said quietly. Daniel looked back at her. "What do you suggest?" Nina stepped forward calmly. "First, tell your men to stay out of my way." The warehouse door suddenly rattled under the impact of something heavy striking from the outside. One of the guards muttered, "We're about to have a problem." Nina flexed her fingers once, testing circulation. "You already do," she replied. Then she looked directly at Daniel Mercer. "And now you're going to see how expensive this mistake could have been." The first impact against the warehouse door sounded like a battering ram striking metal. The second hit harder, bending the steel frame inward, with a deep grinding echo that vibrated through the concrete floor. Dust shook loose from the ceiling beams. One of Daniel's men swore under his breath and stepped back instinctively. Daniel Mercer did not raise his voice, but the urgency in his tone sharpened. "Positions." Now, 2 men moved toward cover behind stacked pallets. Another killed the overhead lights nearest the entrance, forcing the attackers to advance from brightness into shadow. The sudden darkness transformed the warehouse into a maze of angles and silhouettes. Nina did not reach for a weapon. She didn't need one yet. She listened. 3 distinct footsteps outside, one heavier than the others. Someone giving quiet instructions. Organized, not street punks. The door crashed open with a violent metallic snap. Cold night air flooded inside as 3 figures moved through the opening. Weapons raised, but not firing immediately. They were scanning, calculating, confirming identities before escalating. Smart. Daniel stepped slightly forward, not lowering his guard but not firing either. "You're trespassing," he said calmly. The man in front removed his hood slowly, revealing a narrow face marked by an old scar that cut through his eyebrow. His smile carried no humor. "You picked up something that doesn't belong to you," the man replied. "We're here to collect." Daniel's eyes hardened. "You followed the wrong lead." The man's gaze shifted briefly to Nina, then back to Daniel. "Looks like you made a mistake," he said. Nina stepped slightly to the side, positioning herself where she could see both the intruders and Daniel's remaining men. She spoke quietly, but every word carried weight. "This conversation is already costing too much." The scarred man tilted his head. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" Nina didn't answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted the loose plastic tie still hanging from her wrist and let it fall to the floor. A small detail, a deliberate signal. She was no longer restrained. If Nina's quiet strength moved you, take a moment to share where you're watching from and tell us what you felt in that moment. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join the conversation. If you were in Nina's position, would you stay calm or would you fight back? One of the intruders noticed and tightened his grip on his weapon. Daniel noticed something else. Nina's stance had changed subtly. Her weight rested evenly across the balls of her feet, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady. "Prepared," the scarred man chuckled lightly. "You don't look like a problem." Nina's response came evenly. "That assumption is why tonight is already going badly for you." One of the intruders moved forward too quickly, attempting to seize control of the moment. He reached for Nina's arm, intending to shove her aside. The motion ended before it began. Nina pivoted sharply, her forearm redirecting his momentum past her centerline. Her heel struck the side of his thigh with precise force, collapsing his stance. Before he hit the ground, her palm struck upward beneath his jaw, snapping his head back and removing him from the equation entirely. The second intruder fired instinctively. The shot struck a steel beam, sparks bursting into the air. Nina stepped inside his line of fire before he could correct aim. Her hand clamped onto his wrist, twisting sharply. The gun dropped. Her knee drove forward, stopping inches from breaking bone but delivering enough force to eliminate resistance. He fell backward, gasping. The third man hesitated. Hesitation ended fights. Nina moved once more, sweeping his balance away with a controlled rotational kick. He crashed against the concrete, weapon sliding across the floor. Silence returned, heavier this time. Daniel's remaining men did not fire. They did not need to. 3 attackers lay incapacitated within seconds. The scarred leader stared at Nina, recalculating everything he thought he understood. "You're not part of Mercer's crew," he said slowly. "No," Nina replied. Daniel watched carefully, absorbing every detail. He had seen trained fighters before, but rarely individuals who demonstrated restraint alongside precision. "You followed the wrong vehicle," Daniel said to the scarred man. "We follow opportunity," the man replied. And tonight looked promising. Nina folded her arms loosely, her breathing already steady again. "Opportunity often looks different from the inside," she said. Sirens sounded faintly in the distance, not police, but harbor security vehicles responding to reports of disturbance. Time had narrowed. Daniel stepped forward slightly. "You made your point," he told the intruders. "Now leave before this becomes more complicated." The scarred man gave Nina a final assessing look. "You created interest tonight," he said. Nina's expression did not change. "I didn't create anything," she replied. "You chose the wrong door." After a tense pause, the intruders retreated, dragging their injured associate toward the exit. Engines roared to life moments later, fading into the distance. The warehouse remained silent. One of Daniel's men exhaled shakily. "Boss, who is she?" Daniel did not answer immediately. His attention remained on Nina, You fight like someone who understands consequences, he said. I avoid fights whenever possible, Nina replied. Tonight wasn't possible. Daniel gestured toward a chair that had not been overturned during the chaos. You could have left when the door opened, he observed. Nina shook her head slightly. Leaving without resolving confusion creates future problems. One of Daniel's men shifted uncomfortably. Boss, we should relocate. Whoever tracked us once might try again. Daniel nodded. Prepare the car. The men moved quickly, grateful for direction. Nina picked up her jacket from the back of the chair where it had been dropped earlier. Daniel spoke again, voice quieter now. You were taken here by mistake. I owe you acknowledgement. I'm not looking for compensation, Nina said. That isn't what I offered. She paused. What are you offering? Clarity, Daniel replied. People who operate in uncertain environments benefit from understanding each other's boundaries. Nina considered the statement. You intended to threaten someone else, she said. Yes. And your mistake nearly created a larger conflict. Daniel did not deny it. I employ people to prevent disorder. Tonight they contributed to it. Nina slipped her hands into her jacket pockets. Choose better employees. One of Daniel's men almost smiled before catching himself. Daniel inclined his head slightly. That is being addressed. Outside, the air had grown colder. The faint smell of rain drifted from the water. Nina walked toward the exit but stopped near the doorway. You run an operation that depends on reputation, she said without turning around. Daniel watched her carefully. Yes. Then tonight never happened. Daniel understood the statement for what it was, not a request, but a boundary. You have my word, he said. She nodded once. As she stepped into the night, Daniel spoke again. If someone else makes the same mistake, Nina glanced back over her shoulder. They won't. Her tone held no arrogance, only certainty. Daniel remained in the warehouse for several seconds after she disappeared into the darkness beyond the loading yard. One of his men approached carefully. You want us to find out who she is? Daniel considered the question. Then he shook his head. No. Why not? Daniel looked toward the open doorway where the cold wind moved quietly through the empty space. Some people are safer left unidentified. By the time Nina reached the main street, the night air had turned colder, carrying the sharp scent of incoming rain from the Atlantic. She walked at a steady pace, neither rushing nor lingering, her mind replaying the last 40 minutes with precise clarity. Mistakes rarely occurred alone. The men who followed Daniel's vehicle had not acted randomly. Someone had been watching movements near the docks, long before the wrong waitress had been taken. She entered a small diner 2 blocks from her apartment, a place open 24 hours where the coffee was always fresh and the lighting was deliberately soft. Places like this survived because they understood their customers. Older patrons came for routine as much as for food. Routine offered control in a world that changed too quickly. Mrs. Gibbons, a retired school secretary who sat at the same corner booth every Wednesday, looked up from her tea. You're late tonight, Nina. Long shift, Nina replied, offering a small smile. You look like you walked through the wind, the older woman observed. Feels like rain coming. Mrs. Gibbons nodded approvingly, as if Nina had passed a small test. Conversations among older Americans often carried subtle signals of trust. Direct questions were avoided. Observations replaced interrogation. Nina ordered coffee and scrambled eggs. The waitress poured without asking, accustomed to regular habits. The simple act grounded her breathing back into normal rhythm. Ordinary moments mattered. They reminded her why she had chosen this life. 2 booths away, a retired truck driver spoke loudly about rising fuel costs. Another customer discussed knee surgery recovery with the patience of someone accustomed to explaining physical limitations repeatedly. Nina listened without appearing to listen, absorbing tone, cadence, emotional weight. People survive difficulty by continuing forward, not by dwelling on past conflict. Her phone buzzed once. Unknown number. She ignored it. Then it buzzed again. Persistence suggested urgency. She answered without speaking first. Miss Walker. Daniel Mercer's voice came calmly through the line. She did not ask how he obtained her number. Men like Daniel maintained networks built on information flow. You said tonight never happened, Nina replied. It hasn't, Daniel answered, but complications rarely respect intentions. Nina stirred her coffee slowly. What kind of complication? A second inquiry about you occurred 30 minutes ago, Daniel said. The group that followed us wasn't improvising. They were searching. For me? Nina asked. For leverage, Daniel corrected. They believed you were someone else. That misunderstanding may not disappear as easily as we prefer. Nina remained silent for several seconds. Information carried weight. So what do you want? She asked. Nothing, Daniel said. I'm informing you because mistakes tend to repeat when ignored. And why warn me? Because individuals who maintain discipline are rare, Daniel replied, and rare assets attract attention. I'm not an asset. Everyone is something to someone, Daniel said evenly. Nina ended the call without another word. Mrs. Gibbons looked over her glasses. Trouble? She asked gently. Just business confusion, Nina replied. The older woman nodded knowingly. People complicate simple things. That they do. Nina finished her meal and left exact payment plus tip. Predictability created fewer memories for observers. Back at her apartment, she checked the hallway before unlocking her door. Old habits remained useful. The small space reflected minimalism, neutral furniture, no personal photographs, no clutter suggesting emotional attachment. Stability did not require decoration. She removed her shoes and stretched carefully, testing the muscle tension in her legs. The brief conflict earlier had not required full effort, but readiness required maintenance. A framed certificate hung inside her closet rather than on any visible wall. United States National Collegiate Taekwondo Championship. Second place. 8 years ago. Another reminder of a life deliberately left behind. Her phone vibrated again. This time, a text message. Unknown sender. We know you're not a waitress. No punctuation. No greeting. Direct pressure tactic. Nina deleted the message immediately. Fear often entered quietly. Control required refusing to engage prematurely. Across the river, Daniel Mercer stood in his office reviewing surveillance still images from nearby traffic cameras. Dominic Hale, his senior operations advisor, adjusted the display. No prior criminal record, Dominic said. No social media footprint worth mentioning. Rental history clean. Employment consistent. Daniel studied Nina's posture captured in grainy warehouse footage. She didn't panic, he said. People trained in conflict rarely do. Dominic replied. You think she's law enforcement? No, Dominic said. Law enforcement announces authority eventually. She did not. Daniel nodded slightly. What about the group that followed us? Dominic changed the screen to display a partial vehicle plate. Small independent crew, possibly hired muscle testing our perimeter. They were not testing, Daniel said. They were searching. For here. For leverage, Daniel repeated quietly. Dominic leaned back in his chair. You want us to monitor her? Daniel paused. Monitoring created escalation. Escalation created unnecessary visibility. No, Daniel said finally. We avoid entanglement. Dominic raised an eyebrow. That's unusual advice coming from you. Daniel closed the file. Experience suggests certain variables should remain untouched. Later that night, Nina stepped onto her small apartment balcony overlooking the quiet street. A city bus passed slowly, brakes sighing at the corner stop. An older couple walked their dog beneath streetlights, discussing grocery prices and grandchildren with the steady rhythm of people accustomed to adapting rather than complaining. Ordinary life continued. That had always been the goal, but she understood patterns. Someone had mistaken her identity once. Others might try again. Strength alone rarely prevented conflict. Wisdom prevented repetition. Her phone remained silent for the rest of the night. Still, Nina slept lightly. Somewhere beyond the calm streets, questions had begun moving quietly between individuals who traded information for advantage. And once a name entered circulation, removing it entirely became difficult, especially when no one knew exactly who that name truly belonged to. The morning routine returned with quiet precision, as if the previous night had belonged to someone else's life. Nina arrived at Harborline Steakhouse 10 minutes early, tying her apron with practiced efficiency. The kitchen carried the familiar scent of coffee, grilled onions, and fresh bread warming in the oven. Familiar rhythms stabilized the mind. She greeted Carl, the morning prep cook, with a polite nod, then checked the reservation sheet posted near the hostess stand. Predictability remained her strongest defense. The lunch shift drew an older crowd, many of them longtime residents of the waterfront district, retired dock supervisors, former teachers, couples who had lived through recessions and recoveries with equal endurance. They valued quiet service and respectful conversation. Nina understood how to offer presence without intrusion. At table 7, Mr. Donnelly unfolded his newspaper carefully. the way men did when habits formed before smartphones replaced print. He ordered black coffee and oatmeal, then paused before handing back the menu. "You look tired," he observed. "Late night," Nina replied. "Storm coming," he said, tapping the window with one finger. "Pressure changes make people restless." "Maybe," Nina answered. Mr. Donnelly smiled faintly. "Or maybe the world just never slows down the way it used to." His comment lingered after she walked away. Older generations often carried a quiet understanding that stability required constant adjustment. They had learned to live with uncertainty without dramatizing it. At 12:15 p.m., a black sedan passed the restaurant twice before parking across the street. Nina noticed without appearing to notice. The driver remained inside longer than necessary. Not law enforcement, no official markings, no urgency. Observation did not equal reaction. 20 minutes later, a man in his mid-50s entered the restaurant alone. He wore a navy jacket appropriate for mild weather. But the stiffness in his posture suggested purpose beyond lunch. His eyes scanned the room once before settling on Nina. Controlled interest. He selected a booth with a clear view of both exits. Nina approached with neutral composure. "Coffee?" she asked. "Black," he replied. "Thank you." He waited until she returned with the cup before speaking again. "You handled last night efficiently." The words carried no threat, only confirmation. Nina placed the coffee down gently. "You have the advantage of me," she said. "My name is Harold Finch," the man replied. "Independent risk assessment consultant." "That sounds intentionally vague," Nina said. "It is," Finch admitted. He slid a business card across the table. The card displayed only a name and phone number. No company logo. No address. Nina did not pick it up. "You're not law enforcement," she said. "No, not with Mercer." "No." "Then what do you want?" Finch leaned back slightly. "Information moves quickly through certain circles. A professional skill set appearing unexpectedly tends to generate curiosity." "I'm a waitress," Nina said calmly. Finch smiled faintly. "You're disciplined. That is rarely accidental." Nina remained silent. Finch continued carefully. "Last night created questions. Questions attract interest from individuals less polite than me." "That sounds like a warning." "It is." Nina crossed her arms loosely. "I don't involve myself in other people's business." Finch nodded. "That approach works until other people involve themselves in yours." She met his gaze evenly. "And why involve yourself?" "Because balance prevents escalation," Finch said. "Your presence disrupted an anticipated chain of events. I was taken by mistake." "Yes," Finch agreed, "but the correction revealed capability." Nina considered the conversation carefully. People like Finch operated between structures neither criminal nor official, but connected enough to anticipate movement. "What do you recommend?" she asked. "Continue your routine," Finch said. "Predictability reduces perceived threat. And if someone insists on misinterpreting routine, then the problem belongs to them." Finch left cash on the table and stood. "One more thing," he added quietly. "Mercer is not the most dangerous individual paying attention right now." He walked out without waiting for a response. Nina cleared the table herself, pocketing the business card without examining it. Information often became useful later. Across the street, the black sedan remained parked. Inside, Daniel Mercer watched through the windshield as Finch exited the restaurant. Dominic Hale sat in the passenger seat. "You trust him?" Dominic asked. "I trust his instinct for self-preservation," Daniel replied. "And Nina Walker?" Daniel did not answer immediately. "She avoids attention," Dominic continued. "People who avoid attention usually have reason." Daniel observed Nina through the restaurant window as she poured coffee for another customer. "She could have created a problem last night," he said. "But she didn't." "Exactly." Dominic frowned slightly. "You still think we should leave this alone?" Daniel nodded. "Unnecessary involvement creates instability." Dominic crossed his arms. "Others won't follow that logic." Daniel's gaze remained steady. "They will if they understand the cost." Back inside, Nina delivered a plate of grilled chicken to Mrs. Patterson, who always requested extra lemon and spoke fondly of her late husband's service in the Coast Guard. Conversation drifted toward weather patterns, rising insurance costs, and grandchildren visiting during summer months. Ordinary concerns, predictable rhythms, but Nina noticed small deviations. 2 unfamiliar customers lingering without eating. 1 man pretending to read a menu for too long. Attention disguised as coincidence. Her phone vibrated once in her apron pocket. Unknown number again. She did not check immediately. Mrs. Patterson folded her napkin carefully. "You know," the older woman said gently, "people your age always look like they're carrying more than they say." Nina gave a small polite smile. "Everyone carries something." Mrs. Patterson nodded knowingly. "Just remember, strong people sometimes forget they're allowed to ask for help." Nina paused slightly at the words. Help implied vulnerability. Vulnerability required trust. Trust required history. Still, the sentiment lingered. That evening, Nina finished her shift and stepped outside into light rain reflecting streetlights across wet pavement. The black sedan had disappeared. The unknown number did not call again. But the sense of observation remained. Not immediate danger. Something quieter. Interest. And interest, once sparked, rarely faded quickly. Nina walked toward home at her usual pace, blending easily into the rhythm of commuters and late shoppers carrying groceries through the damp evening air. She intended to maintain routine. Routine created distance from chaos. But distance did not always prevent approach. Somewhere beyond visible streets, conversations continued about a waitress who had corrected a mistake too efficiently to ignore. And curiosity, once awakened, often became its own form of pursuit. The rain continued through the night, tapping softly against Nina's apartment window as the city settled into its quieter rhythm. By morning, the streets smelled faintly of wet asphalt and roasted coffee drifting from the corner cafe. Routine remained intact, yet the air carried a subtle tension she could not ignore. A tension, once triggered, rarely dissolved on its own. Nina arrived at work early again, tying her apron with the same measured movements that had structured her days for years. Harborline Steakhouse felt unchanged, grounded in the predictable habits of customers who valued consistency more than novelty. Carl nodded from the kitchen, sliding a tray of bread into the oven. The manager complained lightly about rising supply costs, the kind of conversation that signaled normalcy. At table 3, Mr. Hargrove folded his newspaper carefully. "Markets are nervous again," he said without looking up. "They always are," Nina replied as she poured his coffee. "Instability travels faster now," he added. "Used to be problems stayed where they started." Nina nodded politely, though the words carried more relevance than he intended. At 11:40 a.m., the lunch crowd thickened. Familiar faces created a protective pattern of routine interaction. Nina moved between tables, memorizing small details automatically. Who preferred less salt, who liked extra napkins folded twice, who appreciated brief conversation and who preferred silence. Then the door opened again. 2 men entered together, both dressed in casual jackets that tried too hard to appear ordinary. They paused slightly too long before choosing a table. Nina recognized the pattern immediately. Observer, not customers. She approached calmly. "Lunch menu?" she asked. "Coffee first," one of them said. His accent carried faint Eastern European edges. Nina poured without comment. Their eyes followed her movement with professional subtlety. Amateurs had already approached her once. These men were more careful. Across the street, Daniel Mercer's sedan remained parked beneath the shade of an aging oak tree. Dominic Hale sat behind the wheel, scanning the restaurant entrance. "You were right," Dominic said quietly. "Interest is increasing." Daniel watched through the windshield as the 2 unfamiliar men took their seats. "They're probing," he said. "For her?" "For information," Daniel corrected. Dominic crossed his arms. "You still intend to avoid involvement?" Daniel's gaze remained fixed. "Involvement implies ownership. We own nothing here." Inside the restaurant, Nina placed a plate of grilled salmon before Mrs. Patterson, who smiled warmly. "You always remember," the older woman said. "It matters," Nina replied. Mrs. Patterson leaned closer slightly. "You seem distracted today." "Just busy," Nina said. The older woman studied her face gently. "My husband used to say trouble arrives quietly first. Loud problems come later." Nina offered a small smile. "Wise man." Mrs. Patterson nodded. "He learned the hard way." At the observers' table, one of the men finally spoke directly as Nina approached again. "You work here long?" he asked. "Long enough," Nina answered. "You ever train?" The second man asked casually. "Train?" "Sports. Discipline. You carry yourself like someone who does." Nina tilted her head slightly. "Years ago." "What kind?" "Nothing relevant to waiting tables." The first man smiled faintly. Everything relevant eventually becomes relevant again. Nina met his gaze evenly. Not always. She walked away before further conversation developed. In the kitchen, Carl noticed the tension in her posture. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. "Just a long week," Nina replied. Carl nodded. "You remind me of my daughter," he said. "She served in the Navy, always watching the exits even at family dinners." Nina paused slightly. "Habit," she said. "Habit keeps people alive," Carl replied matter-of-factly. The lunch shift ended without incident, but the observers remained until nearly every table had cleared. Their patience signaled professional interest rather than casual curiosity. When Nina stepped outside for her short break, one of the men followed at a respectful distance. "Miss Walker," he said calmly. She turned. "Yes? You handled a situation recently that disrupted expectations." "I handled being kidnapped," she corrected evenly. He inclined his head slightly. "Unfortunate misunderstanding." "Then let's misunderstand each other less," Nina said. "We represent parties concerned with balance," he continued. "Your involvement altered that balance." "I didn't choose involvement, but you demonstrated capability." Nina's voice remained steady. "Capability does not equal intention. Others may interpret differently. Others should interpret carefully." The man studied her expression. "You don't appear worried. Worry wastes energy, and confidence attracts attention, only when people go looking for it." He nodded once. "If approached again, consider communication before escalation." "Consider not approaching," Nina replied. He almost smiled. "Fair point." He returned inside, leaving Nina alone beneath the muted daylight. That evening, Daniel Mercer reviewed reports in his office overlooking the harbor. "They're circling," Dominic said. "Yes. They think she belongs to you." Daniel shook his head. "She belongs to herself." Dominic leaned forward. "That doesn't stop perception." "No," Daniel agreed quietly. "It doesn't." Nina returned home after her shift, walking past a group of older neighbors discussing property taxes and local council decisions. Their concerns revolved around stability, retirement savings, maintaining control over small pieces of life. She understood that instinct deeply. Control mattered. Inside her apartment, she placed her keys in the same ceramic bowl beside the door. Small rituals reinforced normalcy. Her phone vibrated once more. A voicemail this time. No message. Just silence. Silence sometimes carried more meaning than threats. Nina sat at her kitchen table, reviewing the sequence of events logically. Mistaken identity. Unexpected capability. Growing curiosity. Patterns suggested continued observation. Not immediate danger, but pressure building gradually. She poured a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the evening traffic slow beneath streetlights. The world outside continued normally. Yet somewhere beyond visible streets, calculations continued. Individuals measured risk differently. Some sought control, some sought leverage, some simply sought answers. Nina intended to provide none, but experience had taught her something simple. Interest rarely fades quickly once someone demonstrates the ability to disrupt expectations. And once others began asking questions, silence alone rarely ended the conversation. The following morning arrived with a deceptive calm that almost suggested the previous days had been exaggerated by imagination. Nina reached Harborline Steakhouse before sunrise, the sky still tinted with a pale gray that blurred the line between night and morning. The quiet hour before customers arrived often gave her space to think without interruption. She wiped down tables slowly, aligning salt shakers and folded napkins with careful precision. Control began with small details. Carl was already in the kitchen, humming softly while slicing onions. The smell of butter melting on the griddle filled the restaurant with warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold calculations Nina had been forced to make recently. "You ever notice," Carl said casually, "that problems usually show up in threes?" Nina looked up. "Why three?" "First one gets your attention," Carl replied. "Second, tests your patience. Third tells you it wasn't random." Nina considered that quietly. "Let's hope today stays quiet," she said. Carl chuckled. "Quiet is temporary. Peace takes effort." By mid-morning, the restaurant filled with familiar regulars. Conversations revolved around medical appointments, property maintenance, and grandchildren's school achievements. Older customers often carried stories shaped by decades of adaptation. They rarely dramatized difficulty because they had already survived enough of it. At table 6, Mr. Donnelly folded his newspaper carefully. "You follow the shipping news?" he asked. Not closely, Nina replied. Port delays again, he said. Supply chains still unstable. Funny how problems in one place ripple everywhere else. Everything connects eventually, Nina said. Mr. Donnelly nodded. Exactly. Across the street, a different vehicle sat parked today. Gray SUV. Engine off. Driver remained inside longer than necessary. The pattern repeated. But the faces changed. Nina noticed without reacting. Attention was now layered. Not aggressive. Persistent. At 12:20 p.m., Daniel Mercer sat inside his office reviewing a digital map of port traffic routes. Dominic Hale stood beside him, arms crossed. 2 additional inquiries overnight, Dominic reported. From who? Independent brokers. Private security intermediaries. People asking questions carefully. Daniel leaned back slightly. And our answer? Consistent, Dominic said. We have no relationship with her. Daniel nodded. Good. Dominic hesitated. You're certain we shouldn't establish one? Daniel looked toward the harbor through the tall office windows. People like Nina Walker do not belong to organizations. They influence them anyway, Dominic replied. Daniel gave a faint, knowing expression. That is precisely why we avoid forcing alignment. Back at the restaurant, Nina balanced 3 plates carefully as she approached a table occupied by a retired couple celebrating their 42nd anniversary. The husband struggled slightly to lift his fork due to arthritis. Nina adjusted the plate position without comment. Thank you, the wife said warmly. You always notice. It matters, Nina replied. The husband smiled faintly. Respect is rare these days. Respect is remembered, Nina answered. The woman nodded approvingly. Later that afternoon, Nina stepped outside for a brief break. The gray SUV remained parked, but now the driver pretended to read something on a tablet. Subtle, but visible. Her phone vibrated again. This time the message was direct. We should talk before others decide to. No signature. No explanation. Pressure disguised as professionalism. Nina deleted the message without responding. Escalation often relied on participation. Silence could disrupt momentum. That evening, as the dinner crowd thinned, a new presence entered the restaurant. A woman in her early 60s, neatly dressed in a navy coat, selected a corner booth. Her posture carried authority shaped by years of decision-making responsibility. When Nina approached, the woman spoke first. You maintain composure under observation, she said calmly. Nina set down a glass of water. I provide good service. The woman gave a faint smile. Service is a form of control. Nina waited. My name is Eleanor Shaw, the woman continued. Consultant in organizational risk management. That's becoming a popular title, Nina replied evenly. Eleanor folded her hands. You disrupted several professional assumptions recently. I was kidnapped, Nina said calmly. I adapted. Adaptation reveals preparation. Preparation is useful. Eleanor nodded. You have attracted interest from individuals who do not typically agree on anything. I'm not interested in attention. Attention is already interested in you. Nina remained silent. Eleanor continued. You prevented escalation inside Mercer's warehouse. That changed projections. I prevented injury. You prevented instability, Eleanor corrected. Nina studied the woman carefully. You seem well informed. I value stability, Eleanor said simply. And what do you want? To ensure unnecessary conflict does not develop. That depends on others, Nina said. Partially, Eleanor agreed, but perception matters. Nina leaned slightly against the edge of the booth. I don't work for anyone. I know. I don't join structure. I know that too. Then this conversation is unnecessary. Eleanor smiled faintly. Necessary conversations rarely feel necessary at the time. Nina did not respond. Eleanor stood. One piece of advice, she said. People who demonstrate restraint often underestimate how threatening restraint appears to those who rely on aggression. Nina considered that. Eleanor placed cash on the table. Stability depends on individuals who choose not to misuse strength. After she left, Nina cleared the table slowly. Carl glanced toward the door. Friend of yours? He asked. Someone who values conversation, Nina replied. Carl nodded thoughtfully. Careful with people who enjoy talking about balance. They usually mean power. Nina allowed a faint smile. Power reveals character. Carl shrugged. Character reveals choices. That night, Nina returned home under a sky heavy with clouds reflecting distant city lights. The hallway of her apartment building remained quiet. The same neighbor's television playing softly behind thin walls. Normal life continued uninterrupted, but patterns had changed. 3 different parties had initiated contact within 48 hours. Professional curiosity had become coordinated interest. Nina stood by her window, observing the quiet street below. She did not feel fear. Fear distorted judgment. Instead, she considered boundaries. She had already demonstrated capability. Now she needed to demonstrate disinterest. Attention weakened when denied reaction, but experience reminded her of something equally important. Persistent interest often meant someone believed value existed, and when value became widely assumed, distance alone rarely ended pursuit. The following day unfolded with the careful neutrality Nina had trained herself to maintain under pressure. Routine remained intact on the surface, but beneath that calm, the environment had shifted. Too many people had begun asking careful questions in too short a span of time. Curiosity had matured into coordinated observation. Nina arrived early again, unlocking the side entrance for staff before sunrise painted pale reflections across the harbor water. She prepared coffee filters, checked inventory sheets, and reviewed reservations for the evening shift. Predictability created cover. Structure created distance from unnecessary complication. Carl entered through the kitchen door carrying a small paper bag of pastries. "Peace offering," he said, setting the bag on the counter. "My daughter insists I stop skipping breakfast." Nina accepted a croissant politely. "Family pressure can be effective," she said. Carl smiled. "People who care about you tend to notice when something's off." "I'm fine," Nina replied. Carl didn't press further, but his expression suggested he recognized tension beneath her composure. "Just remember," he added, "sometimes independence becomes isolation without us realizing." Nina nodded slightly, though she did not respond. By late morning, the restaurant filled with its usual weekday clientele. Conversations centered around insurance renewals, home maintenance, and local election concerns. These discussions grounded Nina's sense of proportion. Most people faced challenges that required endurance rather than confrontation. Yet she noticed the absence of something. The observers from previous days had not appeared. That absence felt deliberate. Patterns rarely vanished without reason. At 1:05 p.m., Daniel Mercer sat inside a quiet private dining room located 3 blocks from Harbor Line Steakhouse. Dominic Hale reviewed security updates on a tablet. "No visible surveillance on her location today," Dominic said. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "That does not mean observation has stopped." Dominic nodded. "Agreed." Daniel studied the timeline of recent contact attempts. "They pushed too quickly," he said. Dominic frowned slightly. "You think they'll step back?" "Professionals rarely crowd a variable they don't fully understand," Daniel replied. "Pressure applied too early often creates resistance." Dominic looked up. "You're describing her as a variable." Daniel gave a faint smile. "We all are." Back at the restaurant, Nina refilled coffee for Mr. Donnelly, who appeared preoccupied with an article about international shipping delays. "Strange times," he said. "Supply chains, trade disputes, too many people pulling in different directions. Stability requires cooperation," Nina replied. Mr. Donnelly nodded. "And cooperation requires trust. Trust takes time. Sometimes a lifetime," he said. The comment lingered longer than intended. Later that afternoon, Nina stepped into the storage room to retrieve additional linens. The quiet space offered temporary isolation from customer interaction. Her phone vibrated once inside her pocket. Unknown number again. She considered ignoring it. Instead, she answered. "You've been patient," the voice said. "Daniel Mercer." "I assumed patience was strategic," Nina replied. "It is." "What changed?" "Movement has paused," Daniel said. "That concerns me more than activity." Nina leaned lightly against a shelf stacked with folded tablecloths. "Interest fading would be ideal." "Interest rarely fades once professionals invest time." "I did not request attention." "Attention rarely asks permission." Silence followed briefly. "You called for a reason," Nina said. "Yes," Daniel replied. "An intermediary withdrew from further inquiry this morning." "That sounds positive." "It suggests recalculation," Daniel said, "which usually means deeper analysis." "You think they'll approach differently?" "I think they'll approach indirectly." Nina considered that. "Why inform me?" "Because misunderstanding created this situation. Transparency may prevent escalation." "I don't require protection." "I didn't offer protection," Daniel replied calmly. I offered information. Information carried value when used carefully. I prefer distance, Nina said. As do I, Daniel replied. Then we maintain distance. Agreed. She ended the call. Carl knocked lightly on the storage room door. Everything all right? Just confirming tomorrow's shift schedule, Nina replied. Carl nodded. You've got good instincts, he said casually. You notice things most people ignore. Noticing prevents problems. Carl smiled slightly. My wife says ignoring problems prevents headaches. Nina allowed a faint smile. That strategy rarely works long term. That evening, the restaurant hosted a small retirement celebration for a local school principal. Guests spoke about dedication, patience, and the quiet pride of contributing to community stability. Over decades, Nina served plates of roast chicken and vegetables while listening to speeches honoring persistence rather than ambition. Many of the attendees represented the generation that believed consistency built stronger foundations than speed. One of the retired teachers raised a glass. To the people who show up every day, even when nobody notices. The statement resonated unexpectedly. Strength did not always require recognition. Sometimes it required restraint. Across town, Dominic studied updated traffic patterns on his screen. No movement near her residence, he reported. Daniel stood by the window overlooking the harbor lights. They're adjusting approach, Daniel said quietly. You're certain? Curiosity rarely disappears without replacement. Dominic folded his arms. You think she'll hold her ground? Daniel's expression remained thoughtful. She already has. Later that night, Nina walked home beneath clear skies for the first time in several days. The absence of rain created an unusual stillness along the sidewalks. Streetlights cast long reflections across parked cars. Halfway down the block, she noticed something new. Not observation, absence of observation. Experienced professionals often reduced visibility before shifting tactics. She unlocked her apartment door calmly and entered without hesitation. Inside, everything remained exactly as she left it. Routine preserved, control maintained. Her phone remained silent throughout the evening, but silence did not signal resolution, only transition. Nina prepared tea and sat near the window, reflecting on the pattern unfolding. Interest had shifted from visible to strategic. That indicated caution. Caution indicated respect. Respect reduced immediate threat but rarely eliminated long-term attention. She understood something clearly now. The situation would not escalate quickly. Professionals preferred patience. Patience created opportunity. And opportunity often appeared when individuals believed the situation had stabilized. Nina had built her life on consistency. Consistency discouraged intrusion. But sometimes, consistency itself attracted curiosity from those trained to identify anomalies. For now, the pressure had eased, but experience reminded her of one quiet truth. When powerful people pause, it is rarely because they have lost interest. It is usually because they have begun thinking more carefully. The shift in atmosphere became unmistakable the following afternoon. Nothing overt had changed, yet the absence of direct pressure created a heavier tension than open confrontation. Nina had learned long ago that when experienced operators withdrew visible attention, they often redirected effort into preparation. The Harborline Steakhouse remained steady with familiar activity. The midday crowd consisted mostly of older patrons who valued routine and predictability. Conversations drifted through topics of home repairs, retirement accounts, and rising healthcare costs. The world most people lived in moved slowly, shaped by patience rather than urgency. Nina moved between tables with practiced efficiency, but her awareness extended beyond the dining room. The street outside showed no obvious surveillance vehicles. No unfamiliar faces lingered longer than necessary. The silence itself suggested strategy. Carl placed a tray of clean glasses beside her. You ever get the feeling something's about to change? He asked casually. Change happens constantly, Nina replied. Carl shrugged. I mean the kind you can't see yet. Nina allowed a faint smile. Those changes usually arrive quietly. Carl nodded thoughtfully. Storms don't always announce themselves. At table 9, Mr. Hargrove spoke about the closing of a local hardware store that had operated for 40 years. Owner said business wasn't the same anymore, he explained. People buy online now. No conversations, no relationships. Relationships take time, Nina said. And time costs money, he replied with a tired smile. The statement carried truth beyond commerce. Across town, Daniel Mercer reviewed updated security briefings in his office. Dominic Hale stood near the window, studying movement reports across the Port District. "No direct inquiries today," Dominic said. "That doesn't mean disengagement," Daniel replied. Dominic nodded. "They're mapping indirectly now." Daniel closed the file. "They want to understand her motivations." Dominic crossed his arms. "And if they decide she has none?" Daniel looked toward the harbor. "That may concern them more." Later that afternoon, Nina stepped outside for a brief moment of air. The sky had cleared, leaving sharp sunlight reflecting off parked vehicles and storefront windows. She noticed a delivery truck idling across the street longer than required for unloading. Timing mattered. Duration mattered. Observation did not require obvious presence. Her phone vibrated once. A message appeared without introduction. "No further contact requested. Situation stabilized." Nina read the words twice. Stabilized did not mean resolved. It meant postponed. She deleted the message. Inside the restaurant, Mrs. Patterson waved her over. "You look thoughtful today," the older woman said kindly. "Just a long week," Nina replied. Mrs. Patterson stirred her tea slowly. "My husband used to say that tension you don't see is usually the one worth respecting." "That sounds accurate," Nina said. "He also said strong people often forget they deserve peace too." Nina paused slightly. "Peace requires cooperation," she answered. Mrs. Patterson nodded. "And cooperation requires someone choosing not to escalate." The words stayed with Nina long after the table was cleared. That evening, Daniel met privately with Dominic in a smaller office overlooking the marina. The low hum of boat engines created a steady background rhythm. "They've stopped asking direct questions," Dominic said. "Which suggests they've reached preliminary conclusions," Daniel replied. "And those conclusions?" Daniel considered the pattern carefully. "They believe she is independent." Dominic frowned slightly. "That makes her unpredictable." Daniel nodded. "Independent actors are difficult to pressure, which means they will likely disengage unless forced otherwise." Dominic leaned back. "You're assuming she won't create further disruption." Daniel's expression remained thoughtful. "She has shown consistent preference for minimal involvement." Dominic smiled faintly. "That might be the most dangerous type." Daniel did not disagree. As evening settled across the waterfront district, Nina finished her shift and stepped outside into air that carried early hints of autumn. Leaves gathered along the curb in quiet clusters shaped by passing traffic. She noticed no surveillance vehicles, no unfamiliar faces lingering, no indirect contact attempts. The pressure had eased, not vanished, eased. At home, she prepared a simple meal and sat near the window overlooking the street below. A couple in their late 60s walked slowly past the building, discussing travel plans they had postponed for years while caring for aging parents. Their conversation carried the quiet resilience common among those who understood that life rarely unfolded exactly as expected. Nina appreciated that perspective. Strength was not always visible. Often, it appeared as persistence. Her phone remained silent throughout the evening. The absence of contact suggested temporary equilibrium. Professional interest often faded when effort outweighed benefit. Nina had demonstrated competence, but not ambition. Capability without intention rarely justified continued investment. Still, experience had taught her that reputations sometimes formed without consent. And once formed, they circulated quietly through networks that valued information as currency. Across the harbor, Daniel stood alone near the window of his office, reviewing the final update of the day. "No further movement," Dominic confirmed. Daniel nodded. "Then we allow silence to remain." Dominic hesitated. "You don't want to know more about her?" Daniel's expression remained steady. "I know enough." "And what is that?" Daniel looked out toward the dark water reflecting scattered city lights. "She values peace." Dominic considered the statement. "And if peace is interrupted again?" Daniel gave a faint, knowing look. "Then the mistake will belong to someone else." Back in her apartment, Nina turned off the kitchen light and prepared for rest. Routine remained her strongest protection. Predictability discouraged unnecessary interest. For now, the situation had stabilized, not because anyone had asserted dominance, but because each party had recognized the cost of escalation. Balance, once restored, often held longer than expected. Yet Nina understood something clearly. Balance required maintenance, and while silence suggested resolution, experience reminded her of a quiet truth. The most lasting victories often occurred when conflict ended before it fully began. Sunday morning arrived with clear skies and the steady hum of distant traffic drifting through the open window of Nina's apartment. The quiet felt earned rather than accidental, the kind of calm that followed days of measured restraint. The city moved forward without acknowledging how close several small decisions had come to altering its rhythm. Nina prepared coffee and stood beside the narrow kitchen counter, watching early light settle across the street below. A man in his 60s walked his dog with deliberate patience, pausing at each corner as though respecting the pace of aging joints. Across the street, a young couple loaded grocery bags into the trunk of a compact car, discussing budgets and responsibilities in the calm tone of people building stability step by step. Ordinary lives continued uninterrupted. That had always been her intention. Later that afternoon, Harbor Line Steakhouse hosted its usual weekend lunch crowd. Conversations overlapped softly, creating the familiar soundscape of people sharing modest victories and manageable worries. Nina moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her presence steady without drawing attention. Mr. Donnelly greeted her with a nod as she poured his coffee. "You look more rested," he observed. "Better week," Nina replied. "Good," he said. "Peace is harder to come by these days." "Peace requires effort," Nina answered. He smiled faintly. "Most worthwhile things do." At another table, Mrs. Patterson introduced Nina to her visiting sister, who spoke warmly about growing older with dignity rather than fear. "You reach a certain age," the woman said, "and you realize strength isn't about proving anything anymore. It's about knowing when not to." Nina nodded politely, though the words resonated more deeply than the speaker intended. Strength expressed quietly often endured longer. Midway through the afternoon shift, Carl approached with a folded receipt book. "Thought you'd want this," he said. Inside, a customer had left a note beneath the tip line. "Thank you for treating people with respect. It still matters." No signature. Simple acknowledgement. Nina folded the note carefully and placed it in her pocket. Moments like that reminded her why she had chosen this life. Across the harbor, Daniel Mercer stood in his office, reviewing the final weekly reports. Dominic Hale closed a folder and placed it on the desk. "No additional inquiries," Dominic confirmed. "Interest has cooled." Daniel nodded slowly. "Curiosity requires justification. Without escalation, most professionals move on." Dominic leaned against the desk. "You still believe leaving her alone is the correct move?" Daniel looked out at the water. People who seek quiet rarely appreciate being forced into noise. Dominic gave a small smile. "She changed the outcome of that night." Daniel acknowledged the point. "Yes. And you're comfortable not knowing more?" Daniel paused before answering. "Understanding someone's limits is often more useful than knowing their history." Dominic nodded thoughtfully. "Fair enough." That evening, Nina walked home beneath fading sunlight that cast long shadows across the sidewalks. The neighborhood carried its usual calm. A retired couple watered flowers outside their building. A teenage boy helped his grandfather carry groceries up the steps of a narrow townhouse. Small gestures of cooperation shaped communities more than dramatic events ever could. As she reached her apartment door, she noticed a small envelope resting near the mat. No postage, no return address. Inside was a single card. No logo, no explanation, only a short message. Mistakes corrected rarely repeat. She studied the words briefly before placing the card inside a drawer without comment. Some acknowledgments did not require response. Inside her apartment, Nina prepared tea and sat near the window as evening settled across the city. The events of the past week had tested boundaries she had worked hard to maintain, yet restraint had preserved balance. She had not sought conflict. She had not accepted intimidation. She had responded only when necessary. That distinction mattered. Across town, Daniel poured a small glass of whiskey and stood quietly beside the window of his office. The harbor reflected scattered lights, each one representing transactions, agreements, decisions made daily by individuals attempting to maintain order within complicated systems. Dominic entered quietly. "Everything's stable," he said. Daniel nodded. "Good." Dominic hesitated before speaking again. "You ever wonder how many people like her exist?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "Fewer than most assume," he said. "And more than we notice," Dominic replied. Daniel allowed a faint smile. "Probably both." Back in her apartment, Nina turned off the lights and prepared for sleep. The quiet of the room felt genuine again, no longer interrupted by uncertainty. Routine remained intact. Independence preserved. She had demonstrated capability without seeking recognition, respect earned without negotiation, balance restored without escalation. Before closing her eyes, one thought lingered clearly. Power did not always belong to those who controlled systems. Sometimes it belonged to those who understood when not to use it. Morning would arrive again with its familiar rhythm of coffee, conversation, and small decisions shaping ordinary lives. No headlines would mention the mistake that had nearly unfolded. No official report would describe the moment balance shifted quietly inside a dim warehouse near the docks. Yet somewhere within professional networks, a simple conclusion would remain. Some individuals do not need protection. They simply require distance. And the wisest choice, when encountering such people, is often the simplest one. Do not make the same mistake twice. The story reminds us that true strength does not seek attention, and real power does not always need to be displayed. In a world where many try to dominate through fear or control, the greatest advantage often belongs to those who remain calm, disciplined, and guided by principle. Nina represents the quiet dignity of individuals who choose peace, yet refuse to be treated unjustly. The lesson for the audience is clear. Never underestimate those who live modestly, because character is not defined by appearance or status. Justice is not always loud, and courage is not always visible, but integrity creates a kind of influence that commands respect without demanding recognition. Sometimes the strongest people are simply the ones who know when to act and when to walk away. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.